Hey, quick note before we start. This video is for education and entertainment, and it's built on a genuinely alarming stack of research. Alright, let's dig. Here's a story you were told, probably in school, probably by someone you trusted. Once upon a time, humans were miserable cavemen, even if those calories are worse and hungry, and chasing animals, never knowing where their next meal would come from. And more calories means more people. About 12,000 years ago, some genius figured out farming. We planted seeds, we settled down, we grew surplus food, and boom, civilization, cities, art, writing, progress, everything good. The invention of agriculture was the moment humanity finally got its act together. It's a nice story. It's also, according to a lot of the evidence, mostly wrong. Some researchers have gone so far as to call the invention of farming the worst mistake in the history of the human species. And once you actually look at the bones, it's shockingly hard to argue with them. But let's not start with the bones. Let's start with what life was actually like before farming, because that's the part the story gets most backwards. For the vast majority of human existence, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, we lived as hunter-gatherers, and the picture of that life as a constant, desperate, starving struggle is a fantasy. When anthropologists actually studied surviving foraging peoples in the 20th century, they found something that embarrassed a lot of assumptions. These groups often worked strikingly few hours to feed themselves. Some studies suggested that adults in certain foraging societies spent only a handful of hours a day on getting food, and the rest of their time on rest, socializing, storytelling, craft, and just being with each other. One famous line called them the original affluent society, not because they had a lot of stuff, but because their wants were few and easily met, and their diet was spectacular. A foraging band might eat dozens, even hundreds of different plant and animal species across a year. Roots, nuts, fruits, seeds, tubers, greens, honey, fish, small game, large game when they could get it. That variety is a nutritional goldmine. It's incredibly hard to be deficient in some vital nutrient when your diet is that broad. They followed the seasons, they knew the land like the back of their hand, and they ate like people whose lives depended on knowing exactly what was good to eat. There's a detail here that really drives it home. When researchers studied foraging peoples like the San of the Kalahari in southern Africa, living in a semi-desert, not some lush paradise, an actual harsh environment, they still found people meeting their needs with time to spare, sharing food widely, and showing remarkably little of the malnutrition you'd expect. If foragers could thrive in a desert, the idea that pre-farming life was a universal starvation nightmare starts to look less like evidence and more like a story we told ourselves to feel good about what came next. So now let's talk about what happened when we settled down and started farming, because this is where the story falls apart. And one thing to get straight, farming wasn't invented once by one clever person. It was invented independently, separately, in different parts of the world, in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in China along the Great Rivers, in Mesoamerica with maize, in the highlands of New Guinea, and elsewhere. Different peoples, different crops. No contact between them, all stumbling into the same trap at roughly similar points in their histories. That tells you something. The shift to farming wasn't a stroke of genius that spread from a single source. It was something like a gravity well that human societies kept independently falling into, over and over all around the planet. When people switched to agriculture, their diets did not get more varied, they got narrower. Suddenly, instead of 100 foods, a community's survival hinged on a few staple crops, wheat or rice or maize or barley, and a diet built on one or two starchy staples is a nutritional disaster waiting to happen. We can see it in the skeletons. When you compare the bones of foragers to the bones of early farmers in the same region, the farmers are often shorter. Their bones show more signs of nutritional stress. Their teeth are worse. The rise of carbohydrate-heavy diets brought a wave of cavities and dental disease that hunter-gatherers largely didn't have. Some populations lost several inches of average height after adopting agriculture and didn't regain it for thousands of years, in some cases not until the modern era. And it's not just height and teeth. When you study early farmer skeletons closely, you find more of what paleopathologists call stress markers. Lines in the tooth enamel that form when a child's growth is interrupted by hunger or illness, signs of iron deficiency anemia written into the bone of the eye sockets, and more evidence of periods where the body simply stopped growing because there wasn't enough to go around. A diet riding on a single crop is a gamble every single year. If the rains fail or a blight hits, you don't have 100 backup foods to fall back on. You have hunger. Foragers spread their risk across the whole landscape. Farmers concentrated it into one field and prayed. When that field failed, the result was famine, a word that, as far as we can tell, barely applied to the mobile foraging world at all. It gets worse. When you pack a lot of people together in a permanent settlement alongside their stored grain and their newly domesticated animals, you create the perfect conditions for disease. Living in dense, sedentary groups next to livestock is how a huge number of the infectious diseases that have haunted humanity made the jump into our species. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, flu. Many of these have roots in the crowded animal and grain world that farming created. Hunter-gatherers, spread thin and always moving, simply didn't offer diseases the same buffet. Farming didn't just change what we ate, it changed what could eat us. Many of the great plagues of history are, in a sense, farming's children, born in the crowded, grain-rich, animal-packed settlements that agriculture made possible and unleashed on populations that had never faced anything like them. And then there's the stored grain, which sounds like security but came with a hidden cost. A pile of grain is a target. It can be raided, it can be taxed, it can be controlled. When your wealth is a herd of knowledge in your head and the mobility of your own 2 feet, it's very hard for anyone to dominate you. You can just walk away. But when your wealth is a granary, you can't move. Sitting on land you've cleared and can't abandon, suddenly you can be trapped. You can be ruled. This connects to something we've talked about in other videos on this channel. For most of human history, our ancestors lived in fiercely egalitarian bands with no kings, no chiefs, no permanent bosses. They actively suppressed anyone who tried to dominate the group. But farming produced surplus, and surplus produced the first real storable, hoardable wealth. And where you get concentrated wealth, you eventually get people who control it, people who guard it, and people who work it for someone else's benefit. The rough equality of the foraging world gave way over generations to something with a top and a bottom. Farming didn't just feed hierarchy. In a real sense, it invented it. So let me stop and be fair, because if I only tell you the grim side, I'm doing the same thing the old story did in reverse, flattening a complicated truth into a simple slogan. Farming had one enormous, undeniable advantage, and it's the reason we're all here doing this instead of foraging. A field of grain, acre for acre, can feed far more people than the same land left wild. Farming produces more calories per unit of land. Farming populations exploded. They had more children closer together, because settled life removed some of the constraints that kept nomadic birth rates low. And a big, dense population beats a small, healthy one in the long run. For a brutal reason, numbers win. Farming societies could field more workers, more builders, and when it came to it, more warriors. They spread, they pushed into new land, and they overwhelmed or absorbed the foragers around them. Not because farming made individual lives better, but because it made more lives, period. So we didn't choose farming because it was good for us. We got trapped by it because it was good at making more of us. It's one of the great, dark ironies of our history. The thing that made human life measurably shorter, sicker, and less free is also the thing that let human beings cover the entire planet. Every city, every book, every piece of art you love, every good thing civilization ever produced sits on top of that bargain. We traded away leisure, health, and equality, and in exchange we got numbers, permanence, and eventually everything that numbers and permanence make possible. You might be wondering, if it was such a bad deal, why did anyone start? And the answer is that nobody woke up one morning and chose agriculture off a menu. It crept in. Long before full farming, people were already lingering near rich wild stands of grain, harvesting them, maybe clearing competing plants, maybe scattering a few seeds to encourage next year's crop. In the Middle East, a people we call the Natufians were living in permanent villages and harvesting wild cereals before they were truly farming anything. They settled down first and farmed second. Each small step made sense on its own. Why not stay near the good grain patch? Why not help it along a little? Nobody could see that 100 generations of those reasonable little steps would end in tax collectors, plagues, and kings. That's the thing about a trap. It never looks like a trap while you're walking into it. It looks like a series of sensible choices. And here's the twist that makes this more than just a downer. Once the trap closed, there was almost no going back. A dense farming population can't just decide to return to foraging. There are far too many mouths, and the wild land can't support them all anymore. And the knowledge of how to live off it fades within a few generations. Each step deeper into agriculture made the previous way of life less recoverable. We didn't walk into civilization with our eyes open, admiring the view. We backed into it, one reasonable-seeming decision at a time, until the door had quietly shut behind us. And I have to say a word about who did the work, because farming reshaped that too. Grinding grain into flour, day after day, is punishing repetitive labour, and in many early farming societies it fell heavily on women. We can actually see it in their skeletons, bones and joints marked by endless hours kneeling and grinding at a stone. The flexible, shared, everyone pitches in rhythm of foraging life hardened, in a lot of places, into rigid daily grind work, quite literally. The romantic image of the farm as a wholesome family working the sunny fields together hides a lot of aching backs and worn-down knees, and a lot of them belong to women who spent their lives at the grinding stone. I think there's something genuinely useful in knowing this, beyond just being a great fact to drop at dinner. Because we tend to assume that every major change in human history was progress, that newer is better, that each revolution made life obviously nicer. There's something genuinely useful in knowing this, beyond just being a great fact to drop at dinner. Because we tend to assume that every major change in human history was progress, that newer is better, that each revolution made life obviously nicer. There's something genuinely useful in knowing this, beyond just being a great fact to drop at dinner. Because we tend to assume that every major change in human history was progress, that newer is better, that each revolution made life obviously nicer. The story of farming is a giant asterisk on that assumption. Sometimes a change that looks like an unambiguous triumph is actually a trade-off, so lopsided that the people living through it got the worse end of the deal, even as their descendants inherited a world that couldn't exist without it. So the next time you hear someone talk about the dawn of civilization like it was humanity finally waking up, you'll know the fuller story. The first farmers weren't liberated. Many of them were shorter, sicker, and more overworked than the free-ranging foragers who came before them. They built the foundation of everything we have, and a lot of them paid for it with their teeth, their spines, and their freedom. All the sources are in the description. The paleopathology on early farmer skeletons, the original affluent society debate, the work on disease and domestication. Go argue with it. This is one of those topics where reasonable people still disagree, and that's exactly what makes it worth chewing on. And remember, those first farmers are your family too. Everything we are, we owe to that bargain they made. So stay curious about the real cost of the world you inherited and keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye.